He was just the florist. At least, that's what everyone thought when he arrived at the estate gates that morning, dressed plainly, sleeves rolled up, and arms full of lilies. No camera turned his way. No one asked his name. But inside him, Lucas Hartley carried 12 years of love that had never once been acknowledged aloud. The funeral of Malcolm Arbor was the kind that drew headlines. The kind where the guest list looked like a red carpet roster. Billionaires, editors, designers, ambassadors, all gathered to mourn the loss of a man hailed as a genius and celebrated. Oddly, for his solitude. Every obituary called him unmarried, private, devoted only to his empire. They wrote it like a badge of honor, like silence was elegance, like invisibility was legacy. Lucas knew better. Because while the world painted Malcolm as a man without attachments, Lucas had been quietly waking beside him every morning for over a decade, pouring his coffee, folding his scarves, and once a year, placing a lavender sprig into his pocket just before he stepped onto a stage to receive another award. No one ever asked where the flowers came from, or why they were always lavender. But Malcolm knew, and so did Lucas. That morning, Lucas didn't park at the front. He didn't walk in with the mourners. He came in through the side gate with the service crew, pushing a cart of fresh-cut arrangements, white lilies, hyacinths, ivory roses, and tucked carefully into one bouquet, hidden in plain sight, a single sprig of lavender. He didn't need to be seen. He just needed to place the flowers where Malcolm would have wanted them. Inside the estate, everything felt choreographed. Velvet ropes, whispered directions, portraits of Malcolm in grand frames, all striking the same pose, chin up, eyes forward, alone. Lucas moved through the hall with the precision of someone who had memorized every corner of the house. He wasn't meant to be there, not officially, but his feet knew the path. Down the marble corridor, left at the library, past the guest wing, and then Felicity appeared, sharp-shouldered, dressed in black silk, her voice as clipped as the diamond brooch on her chest. She glanced at Lucas, blinked once, and gestured toward the east hallway. The restroom flowers, if you don't mind. It wasn't a request. It was dismissal in disguise. Lucas nodded, even smiled faintly. He didn't argue. He had no need to. He walked where she pointed, wheeled the bouquet into the guest bathroom near the conservatory, and opened the door. That was when his breath caught. There, above the hand towel rack, in a frame that didn't belong, hung a photo. Not one of the carefully curated portraits placed around the estate. This one was smaller, candid, and deeply out of place. Malcolm, smiling, sleeves rolled up, covered in pollen, stood beside Lucas in a Tuscan greenhouse, holding a vase of wild lavender between them. Only 2 people in the world had that photo. It was never meant for public eyes, and someone had hung it in the guest restroom. Lucas stared for a moment that stretched into silence. His hands trembled slightly as he set the flowers down, not from fear, but from the flood of questions that surged up all at once. Who put it there? Why here? Was it a cruel joke, a final insult, or was it a message? He stepped back, trying to steady his breath. The laughter echoing faintly down the hallway reminded him where he stood. This wasn't his home anymore. It never really had been. He was still just the florist, at least to them. But Lucas knew something they didn't. Malcolm had always promised him one day, they'll know the truth, but it has to come from you. Lucas never thought that day would arrive, let alone at the man's funeral. Yet now, a single photo in a forgotten hallway had cracked something open. It was quiet, but it was beginning. And Lucas, for the first time in years, didn't lower his eyes. He stood still, straight, present. Because love, real love, doesn't die when the heart stops. Sometimes, it starts breathing only after the world goes quiet. If this story touched something in you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to Heart Stories for more quiet truths, hidden loves, and the people brave enough to stand in them. The estate was alive with grief, but it was the polished kind, the kind that came with pressed suits, whispered condolences, and expensive perfume. No one sobbed. No one broke. It was a performance of sorrow, and every actor knew their cue. At the center of it all stood Felicity Arbor, widow of Malcolm's late brother, now the unofficial matriarch of the Arbor name. She had a face carved for public appearances, elegance without warmth, beauty without softness. Every gesture was calculated. Every sentence ended like a full stop. Her presence commanded the room. And yet Lucas knew it wasn't just power she carried. It was fear, the fear of losing control over something she believed had always belonged to her family. Beside her stood David, her son, 29, clean-shaven, with Malcolm's bone structure, but none of his fire. The media called him the heir apparent, the chosen one to continue the Arbor legacy. He accepted praise with ease, but never asked where the spotlight came from. Lucas had seen him before, in passing, at events where Malcolm made brief appearances. David always looked through people, especially the ones who didn't wear a last name that matched the plaque on the gate. Lucas stayed in the shadows, observing. He moved from room to room, checking floral placements, adjusting what the assistants had misaligned. No one noticed him. Not really. That was the gift and the curse of his position. He was allowed to exist, as long as he stayed invisible. But that changed when he passed by the drawing room. Felicity's voice, sharp and precise, floated into the hallway. "The reading is tomorrow. Make sure the lawyer has the correct copy." David replied, lower but no less clipped. "Of course, Ston, and the foundation papers, signed and sealed. Everything transfers to you. It's what Malcolm wanted. No unnecessary drama, and definitely no surprises." Lucas paused. He didn't plan to eavesdrop, but something about her tone wasn't just administrative, it was defensive. Too rehearsed. Too final. He moved on quickly, pretending to study a table arrangement. But a seed had been planted, and it would grow fast. Later that afternoon, just before the guests began to leave, a man in a gray suit approached him at the far end of the garden. Middle-aged, balding, carrying a clipboard. "You're the florist?" he asked. Lucas nodded. The man handed him an envelope. No return address, just his name, in handwriting he hadn't seen in months. Lucas's breath caught in his throat. The man offered no explanation, just said, "I was told to deliver this today," quietly, then walked away. Lucas stepped behind a trellis and opened it. Inside, a note in Malcolm's handwriting. Short, no greetings, no signature. "If they try to erase you, let them see what I kept hidden. Go to my lawyer, ask for the real will. Use the name I gave you, Lavender." His hands trembled again, but not from grief this time. It was the weight of something awakening. Lavender. It had been their secret. A pet name, born from the first bouquet Lucas had ever delivered to Malcolm's penthouse. He had joked that day, "You look like someone who needs more lavender in his life." Malcolm had laughed, and it had stuck. For 12 years, only one person had ever called him that. And now the name was a key. Lucas slipped the note into his jacket. The sounds of the funeral faded behind him as he stepped into the servant hallway and found a moment to breathe. A day ago, he had planned to place the flowers and leave, fade out, as he always had. But someone had hung a photo. Someone had delivered a note. And Malcolm, even in death, was asking him not to disappear this time. The performance was over, and the real story was just beginning. The next morning came heavy with gray clouds and a silence that felt intentional. Lucas arrived early at the law firm's office downtown, where the official reading of Malcolm's will was set to begin. He wore a muted navy sweater, the same one Malcolm used to steal from his closet during cooler nights. There was no invitation with his name, no seat reserved in the polished conference room. He entered as part of the staff, not the story. Inside, the room buzzed with nervous expectancy. Felicity sat at the head of the table, composed as ever, her hands folded neatly in her lap. David leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone who believed the ink had already dried in his favor. Beside them were a few extended relatives, distant cousins, corporate advisors, and 2 board members from the Arbor Foundation. Lucas didn't sit. He stood quietly in the back, near the wall of windows, where sunlight tried but failed to break through. The lawyer, Mr. Clayton, entered and placed a leather folder on the table. He cleared his throat. "Thank you all for being here. As per the wishes of the late Mr. Malcolm Arbor, I will now read the contents of his will, dated 8 months prior to his passing." What followed was a list of standard formalities: donations to charities, disbursement of artwork, shares in the company left to David, the estate, the primary residence, and its contents left to Felicity. There were nods, smiles, exchanged glances of relief. No mention of Lucas, not even a footnote. He felt the silence in his bones. It wasn't shock, it was confirmation. They had done it. They had erased him completely, like he'd never existed in Malcolm's life at all. But he didn't leave, not yet. Mr. Clayton paused, then reached into his briefcase and pulled out a second envelope. Thicker, older. The seal was wax, deep purple, stamped with Malcolm's personal insignia, not the family crest. He looked up. There is a secondary directive, with instructions to be followed only in the presence of an individual identified by a private name. His eyes scanned the room. Is there anyone here who would recognize the name? Lavender, single cough broke the hush. Lucas stepped forward. "I'm Lavender," he said simply. Gasps rippled through the room like a dropped stone in water. Felicity stiffened. David scoffed. One of the board members leaned in, whispering something behind a raised palm, but Lucas didn't flinch. Mr. Clayton motioned for him to approach. "Please, stand here beside me." As Lucas stepped forward, the lawyer opened the second envelope. Inside was a letter, hand-signed by Malcolm, dated only 2 months before his death, and with it, a USB drive. He inserted the drive into the laptop before him, turned the screen to face the room, and clicked play. Malcolm's face filled the screen. No lights, no makeup, just him, seated in the studio of his home. The lavender wall behind him, a quiet nod to the life no one ever saw. His voice was calm, unapologetic. "If you're watching this, it means I'm gone. And it means Lavender Lucas has found the courage to stand where I never let him be seen. For that, I'm sorry. For 12 years, he loved me without name, without title, without question. I gave the world my vision, my empire, my curated silence. But he gave me a home in the room no one moved. To my family, you erased him from every photo, refused to invite him to dinners. You called him the help. But he's the only person who ever stayed when I had nothing to offer but myself." The screen faded to black, then returned with words on white: "Last will and testament, revised copy, legally notarized." Mr. Clayton began reading again. The true contents. The foundation transferred to Lucas. The estate granted solely to Lucas. The shares split between charities and a new fund, the Lavender Trust, aimed at supporting LGBTQ+ youth in creative industries. Funded directly from Malcolm's art collection and personal investments. David stood up, eyes blazing. "This is a mistake." But Clayton raised a hand calmly. "This is legal, witnessed, notarized, and filed in 2 countries. There is no mistake." Felicity said nothing, just stared, as if the legacy she thought was secure had slipped soundlessly through her fingers. Lucas stood, not with triumph, but with quiet, exhausted grace. He hadn't come to win. He'd come to be remembered. And now there was no going back. Lucas didn't return home that night, not to the apartment filled with Malcolm's scarves, nor to the silence that used to feel warm when Malcolm was still alive. Instead, he walked for hours through downtown streets that had always looked polished, yet impersonal. A city Malcolm had helped shape, brick by billboard, but where Lucas had always felt like a shadow moving beside a monument. The following morning, Lucas returned to the Arbor estate, not with a suitcase or a speech, but with a small notebook Malcolm had once gifted him. Its pages were blank. Malcolm had said, "For the thoughts you don't want to forget." Lucas had never written a word in it, but today he needed to. The housekeeper opened the gate without question. The staff had seen the video. The whispers had already started. Inside, the estate felt different. The air was lighter somehow, not freer, just more honest. Lucas walked the halls slowly, noting every detail that had once excluded him: the family portraits arranged chronologically, the curated memorabilia with names and plaques, the obvious absence of anything that hinted he had ever existed. He stopped at the gallery room, the one Malcolm never opened to visitors. He turned the knob. The room was quiet. The lights dimmed automatically as he stepped inside. No one had touched it. On the left wall, Lucas saw something that stopped him in his tracks. A canvas unfinished, half covered in charcoal dust, showing two figures in a lavender field. One of them, clearly Malcolm. The other, just an outline, delicate, waiting. Lucas knew who it was. He didn't need features to recognize himself in the space Malcolm had never dared finish. A small card sat on the easel, the only gallery that mattered. For real? His breath caught in his chest. He didn't cry. Not yet. But something shifted in him, a soft cracking of armor. The beginning of grief finally allowed. Later that afternoon, he met again with Mr. Clayton to finalize the transfer documents for the Lavender Trust. The lawyer handed him a letter Malcolm had written specifically for this moment, typed, dated, and signed with a purple inked pen. Lucas, you always told me you didn't need recognition. You just wanted space to be real. That was your word, real. You made me real. In private, when the world only saw the version of me I had sculpted for approval. Now I give you the space, the house, the trust, the name. Not because you need them, but because they've always been yours. You were the only one who never asked me to be anything more than human. Let the world see that love doesn't have to look like legacy to be lasting. Lucas folded the letter carefully, placed it in the back of the notebook, and left the law office with something heavier than power. It was responsibility in a kind he had never carried before. Not the duty of hiding love, but of showing what love looks like when it outlives silence. By the week's end, the foundation went live. The Lavender Trust launched with quiet strength, its mission posted in full scholarships and grants for LGBTQ+ youth in fashion, floral design, and art spaces Malcolm had thrived in, but where young creators like Lucas were still made to feel invisible. Applications flooded in, not from the wealthy, but from those on the margins, kids who signed letters with nicknames, afraid to use real names at home. Lucas read every word. He cried more than once. And in each story, he found echoes of himself from a decade ago, waiting for someone to believe he was worth more than the role he had been assigned. Then, on a warm Thursday, the doorbell at the estate rang. Felicity stood at the threshold, dressed in beige, this time not black. Her expression was unreadable. Lucas opened the door without hesitation. She didn't step inside. I came to say that I hope you do more with this place than we ever did, she said, her voice low. I didn't understand him. I think, maybe I never tried to. Lucas didn't offer comfort, but he didn't turn away. He only said, I'm not here to rewrite him. I'm just here to tell the parts no one else wanted to hear. She nodded once and left without another word. And just like that, a chapter closed, not with revenge, not with applause, but with a soft, necessary end. The house grew quieter each day, though it never felt empty. Malcolm's absence was no longer a void, it had become a presence of its own. Not in the rooms he once stood in, but in the way light poured through the windows differently, in the subtle fragrance of lavender that still lingered in the hallway. In the photo Lucas had framed and placed on the mantle, the candid shot from Tuscany, now hanging where it should have always been. The world had moved on quickly. Newspapers printed the headline, Private Will Upends Family Empire, but the media cycle devoured it and forgot. The public loved a scandal, but they rarely stayed for the silence after. Lucas stayed. He woke early each morning, watered the flowers himself, handled the trust applications by hand, and answered emails from kids across the country who signed off. Thank you for existing. He didn't go on television. He didn't attend galas. But he showed up in every small, deliberate way that Malcolm once did behind closed doors. One afternoon, while tending the small garden behind the flower shop, The same shop he had nearly sold before the will was revealed. Lucas paused in front of the old wooden planter where Malcolm's favorite lavender bush had grown. The plant had withered, dried, a husk of its former beauty. He crouched down, intending to pull it up and start again. Let the soil breathe. But as he lifted the roots, something resisted. His fingers scraped against something solid. He stopped, dug gently. A small plastic capsule lay hidden beneath the surface, coated in soil and wrapped tightly in aged tape. He held his breath, peeled it open, and there, inside, folded carefully in four, was a sheet of paper slightly stained by time. It was Malcolm's handwriting. If one day you're holding this, it means you didn't let go, and neither did I. You always believed love didn't need grand gestures. But I left you this, quietly, like how we loved because I needed you to know something. You weren't the secret of my life, Lucas. You were the center of it. If you're still caring for this plant after everything, then you're still the man I fell in love with, steady, kind, persistent in the smallest ways. Let this lavender bloom again. Let it be the start, not the memorial. Don't mourn me with silence. Grow something louder than grief. Lucas didn't cry right away. He just sat back on the earth, letter in hand, chest open and still. The wind moved softly around him, bending the petals of nearby blooms, carrying a scent he hadn't smelled in months, fresh lavender. Or maybe memory pretending to be scent. He closed his eyes, pressed the letter to his chest, and let the ache wash over him, not with bitterness, but with something closer to gratitude. That evening, Lucas repotted a new lavender sprig in fresh soil, not as a symbol, not as closure, but as continuation. The photo on the mantle remained. The gallery room stayed open. The foundation grew steadily. But the quietest thing Malcolm had left, a capsule buried in earth, had become the most lasting. And in that, Lucas finally understood. He had never been erased. He had simply been waiting to bloom at the right time. Have you ever found someone's love in the smallest, quietest places? If this story touched something inside you, stay. At Heart Stories, we tell the stories that were never meant to be loud, only real. Subscribe for more voices that deserve to be heard, and for love that endures, even when the world forgets.